So I'll be beginning in a few minutes with a discussion about the concept of critical thinking with some brief comments on that. And then we will again recircle and focus more deeply on this conception as we pursue our primary purpose today. Before we deal with the content, though, let me talk a little bit about our work and what we are hoping to accomplish at the Foundation. The Foundation for Critical Thinking is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have been in existence along with our sister institution, the Center for Critical Thinking, for now 35 years. In that time, we have been focused on advancing a fair-minded conception of critical thinking in schools and in communities across the planet. What we are beginning to see are some indicators that would imply that critical thinking is now a term that is being more widely used in human societies. But we have to ask the question, to what extent are we actually fostering the deep learning that is required to educate the mind and to help students learn the skills, abilities, and traits of the educated person that they can then use as they deal with all of the many problems that they'll face in their lives as human beings. And we all know how important some of these pressing problems are that we're facing collectively as humans today. What we have attempted to do throughout our 35 years of existence is to advance and develop a fair-minded conception of critical thinking that is based in natural languages that we can all, as humans, have access to, and that can be contextualized across all domains of human thought, and therefore across all subjects and disciplines and all professions. And as I move forward, some of these more general moves that I'm making will become more clear when I offer more specifics and some examples. So again, this is the first in a series of presentations. We hope to be offering these once a month, and we will be bringing to our critical thinking community the ideas that we believe are important to you. We'll be discussing these ideas with you through this format, and we'll be further advancing the idea of fair-minded critical thinking and the importance of cultivating fair-minded critical societies across the planet. I know that most of you are here, or I would infer that most of you are here because you are concerned to improve your ability to bring critical thinking across the institution, but there are people here who are just teaching, and so I assume you're interested in some other related questions, like how do I bring this into the classroom? So we're focused on the essential ingredients of a professional development program, and in pursuing these essential ingredients, we'll be learning more about critical thinking and developing our understanding of the foundations of critical thinking. In all of our conversations, our critical thinking conversations with fellows, we will be dealing with the foundations of critical thinking and how to contextualize them in human life, in some domains of human thought, and specifically in this case in connection with teaching and learning. There are many ways to begin to understand critical thinking, a substantive conception, or to deepen our understanding of critical thinking. And so, in other words, there's no perfect way to teach critical thinking or to begin to understand it, to begin to unpack it. We need to be able to understand the concept from multiple perspectives and to develop our ability to articulate the conception and look at it from multiple angles in order to better understand it and to be able to leverage it more deeply in our own thinking, to improve our own thinking, and to help our students do the same. So beginning place for this then might be that critical thinking is foundational to the effective teaching of any subject because it provides us a rich set of ideas that enable us to better think our way through an issue, subject, problem, etc. So we're looking for then this rich set of concepts that's promised in a substantive conception of critical thinking. When we understand such a conception, we will see many implications for teaching and learning. I often point out the importance of focusing on the theory of critical thinking rather than simply the strategies. Often faculty want the strategies. They want to know, how do I bring this into the classroom? And sometimes that's translated into this: how can we easily bring a substantive conception of critical thinking to the classroom? And the answer to that, by implication, is we can't. We can't easily bring anything substantive into our thinking or into our lives. So we've got to first ask ourselves, what is this substantive conception? What does it look like? And am I myself beginning to understand it? When I'm doing that, I'll be in a much better position to foster this conception in teaching and learning. When we understand the relationship between thinking and content, then we understand that all content is produced by thinking. In other words, you can take, for instance, any book that is written, such as this or any other book, and see this as a product of human thinking. In this case, two authors, myself and my colleague, Dr. Richard Paul, wrote this piece. And if I'm teaching my students, I want them to see that this and every other book that we might pick up and read, any book that we're given to read for any class, any textbook, any essay, any letter, all of these are products of thinking. And if this is true, then we therefore can analyze and assess the thinking that created this product. And we're in a better position as thinkers to more effectively assess the work that we're reading. So there are many ways to get into this concept of the relationship between content and thinking. But a beginning place may be to understand that every text, every essay, every book is coming from someone's thinking. Therefore, it must adhere to standards of reasonability, to intellectual standards that we'll be focusing on presently if we're to accept what is here. So we're focusing again on the tools of critical thinking that we hope our students will begin to develop and continue to develop over a lifetime. If we understand this, then we also understand that all subjects exist only as modes of thinking. So in other words, we can take any academic discipline such as science, and we can ask ourselves, how can I understand science as a mode of thinking? And let's see if I can give you an example of this now, or a way into this. I understand science or any other subject when I can think scientifically, or in other words, when I can engage my thinking in all of these ways that we'll be unpacking as we move forward. I can formulate scientific questions, pursue scientific purposes, gather relevant scientific information, make reasonable scientific inferences, follow out logical scientific implications, think within a scientific point of view, clarify and use scientific assumptions, clarify and use scientific concepts. And this will be true if I'm thinking within any discipline. If my students, by implication, are thinking scientifically, then they are formulating scientific questions in their own minds as they live their lives, not just in the science class. They know when they are dealing with a scientific component of a question or where there is a scientific component that needs to be considered. And so they're able to make certain intellectual moves that other students will not be able to necessarily make when they have these understandings. And those of you who are familiar with the elements of reasoning and intellectual standards will see these elements and standards here, and I'll come back to the elements and standards presently. One of the things that we want to do, that we need to do in teaching and learning, is we need to give students regular time during our classes to process what we are doing. And in this case, we have a fairly poor platform for discussing between and among us right now. As these electronic platforms become more sophisticated, we'll have more opportunities will be available to us to communicate directly. But because we have so many people here today, we can't do that. But what we can do is bring some processing into this webcast, if you will, in order to continue engaging in your mind, and so that it doesn't feel like I'm just talking to you and you're simply listening, because we know that human learning doesn't work very well that way. So you have the ability to send us some of your questions and to chat with us. We have a person ready here in our office to chat with you if you have questions about any of the work as we move forward. And if you need to leave early, feel free to let us know whether you would like a follow-up discussion. So now, what I want to say is, so that as we move through this, the rest of our discussion here, I will periodically perhaps ask you to just think for a few minutes about what I'm discussing. In the classroom, I would have you turn to the person next to you and to discuss with that person something that I may have discussed or mentioned, or I might have you do a little writing. This is going to be a natural part of a critical thinking classroom. So we can't do that here, but we can do as much of that as possible. So what I would like to do is periodically ask you to just think or to write, so hopefully you have something there to write with as we go through the rest of the discussion. So I have said that content is a product of thinking, and that subjects exist only as modes of thinking. I'm going to add a few points, and I'm going to ask you to think a little bit on your own about some of these ideas. When we understand, when we have in our thinking, when we have developed in our thinking a substantive conception of critical thinking, then we understand that there are essential structures in all reasoning within all subjects that enable us to understand those subjects. And I was just focusing on those for a few minutes ago. So in other words, when we understand that there are these essential structures in thinking, then we can begin to apply them to our teaching every day. So now I'm going to get into some of our primary conceptual sets. When we understand that human reasoning entails these 8 elements: purpose, question, information, interpretation, concepts, assumptions, implications, and point of view. When we understand this and at least some of its depth and complexities, when we have worked these ideas into our thinking as entry points for analysis, then we are able to reason potentially at a much higher level than people who do not have these ideas developed explicitly in their thinking. I'm going to briefly discuss these and suggest that these must be included in a substantive conception of critical thinking. So here's the beginning place for this. Whenever you reason about anything or through any problem, these elements of reasoning are present. You have a purpose. You're asking one or more questions. You're using information. You're making inferences. You begin with ideas, theories, concepts. You begin with assumptions. Your thinking goes in multiple directions, and you think within some point of view. All of us are going through life reasoning through many problems, and we are using these elements. But most of us don't realize we're using these elements, except implicitly. And the argument is that if we understand these elements and are using them explicitly, then we can all elevate our thinking. These ideas are directly related to understanding content as a mode of thinking and subjects as a mode of thinking as well, because every academic subject entails these elements. Every academic discipline exists because a certain group of scholars begins to ask a set of questions that have not been asked before in this precise way. And so new fields emerge as a result of new questions being asked. We're seeing this explosion of specialties in our fields of academia across the board. And we can talk about some problems with over-specialization, but in any case, we're talking right now about how fields of study emerge. When people are no longer asking questions within a field, that field begins to die and to go away. So we want to understand the questions at the heart of a discipline. We want our students to articulate those questions and to be able to formulate those questions and to understand the deep purposes within the disciplines, to understand the points of view that we are trying to foster within the disciplines, to understand the implications of reasoning well within a discipline, to understand the assumptions that are made within a discipline, so they can ask, what assumptions do scientists begin with? And that may be an easier question than the question, what assumptions do psychologists begin with? Because psychology is in many ways a very different field from that of science, where in science we're dealing with many monological questions, or questions where we're looking for, let us say, the right answer, where when we're dealing with human nature it becomes much different and our assumptions become much more diverse. And so within the field of psychology, for instance, we theoreticians do not necessarily agree on our very foundational assumptions. I want my students as thinkers within the field of psychology to understand this, and I want them to understand this very early on, or they won't begin to understand the logic of the discipline. So you see how I can deal with these elements in a kind of cursory way, or I can burrow into any one of them with examples within disciplines and fields. And so, again, there are many ways to articulate the elements, but one is to understand that as you reason through life, you have purposes. You're asking questions. You're using information already. And all of us are doing this perhaps hundreds of times a day, if we could even count, if we could even quantify such a process. So let me pause for a minute and ask you to write down your purpose in being here for this conversation today. What is your fundamental purpose? And what is your fundamental question? And the two should interrelate. I'm going to give you maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes to write down your purpose and the fundamental question that you're asking here today, question that you would like the answer to. And then if you would send us some of your questions, that will help me understand where you are right now in your thinking. So I'll stop talking for a couple of minutes for you to do this activity. So let us continue. As you see, if we had more time, I could ask you to continue around the elements wheel and fill in more of the information as just a practice process. And with faculty, I will want them to understand very early on in working with them their discipline or disciplines as modes of thinking, so that I would want them to articulate the purpose of psychology or science or anthropology or whatever it is that they're thinking. What is the purpose of history? What questions at issue do historians fundamentally ask, or what types of questions? What kinds of information do historians gather? What kinds of interpretations do they make? What organizing ideas do they use in guiding their thinking? Where does their thinking begin in terms of their assumptions, and how are those assumptions formulated? And so what? What are the implications of their thinking? So if I take this historian's thinking seriously, so how is that going to help me as a human being thinking through the problems that I must think through moving forward? And what is the point of view of a historian, or are there multiple points of view? How does it make sense to think of history in terms of point of view? These are some understandings I would want faculty to be working with and to be articulating and to be contextualizing in their own fields of study and with their own students. So we've talked a little bit about the elements, and this is going to come into our discussion a little bit later on key ingredients, because we're going to be arguing for a substantive conception. And a substantive conception of critical thinking, in my view, must entail analysis of reasoning, because humans are fundamentally reasoning animals. That's what we fundamentally do in human life. We do many other things. We do music, we may dance, we do athletics, we cook, we do many things, but all of them are connected to reasoning. And in any case, we also have intimate relationships, and we have and we are parents, and we are friends, and we're a part of a community, and we must get along at work, and this requires critical thinking and a conception of fair-minded critical thinking, and the ability to use these elements effectively and to, again, use them as leverage to improve thinking in all parts of human life. In connection with the analysis of thought, there are intellectual standards that educated persons or reasonable persons use to determine what to accept and what to reject in human thought. And here is an overview or an introduction to 9 intellectual standards. As you see, they're quite intuitive and initially can be easily taught even to very young children. Clarity, accuracy, precision, relevance, depth, breadth, logic or logicalness, significance, fairness. These are standards that you and I use every day in life, but we don't necessarily use them explicitly. So the idea is that, or the argument is that if we're using these explicitly, if these concepts become part of our daily language, then we, again, have tools to improve our thinking. So if I understand that thinking is often unclear, then I can ask certain questions, very, very basic questions that are often missed in human life. Could you elaborate? I really don't understand what you just said. Could you give me an example? Could you illustrate that for me? What could be simpler in terms of intellectual moves? But how often do we fail to make these? And what are the penalties for that failure? We have written a thinker's guide on these intellectual standards in which we are unpacking them. And I want to just mention this right now because I want you to understand the intellectual standards as a very small set of the intellectual standards extant in human languages, or that exist in human natural languages. And when I say natural languages, I mean the kind that we're speaking now, English, Spanish, whatever language that we normally speak, that is our natural language. And we may have multiple natural languages, but this is to be compared with or contrasted with special languages. If people argue that a good way to teach critical thinking is through formal logic or mathematical thinking, I'm going to ask them for the evidence, because that argument is not compelling to me as a human thinker who's tried that theory, and I don't see how it's really going to help me in the deep to deal with the deep questions that I'm facing as a person. And so what I believe that we need and what we argue for here are intellectual standards that we can apply to our thinking, or that we can attempt to routinely adhere to, and by implication that will improve the quality of our thinking. Note how simple these questions are, how foundational they are. And I want to bring in now an analogy, a sports analogy, which may not work for you, and if not, you can come up with your own analogy, perhaps a music analogy or a cooking analogy, or whatever analogy may work best for you. But what I want to focus on is the importance of the foundations when you are learning within any complex field of understanding. If I'm learning tennis and I want to play tennis at the highest level, then I must adhere to the foundations of tennis, and I must do that every time I come out onto the court, not just once or twice. So often I will fail at the level of fundamentals because I don't have my eye on the ball as a tennis player. Keep your eye on the ball. That's a foundational move. It's a move like this in critical thinking. I'm not sure what you just said. Could you tell me that in other words? Or let's say you're giving me this information and you're telling me that I should find this information compelling. Well, first I want to make sure that information is accurate. So what is your source of information? And I'm listening in good faith. I want to hear. I want to be moved by the argument. If it's a good argument. If it's actually true, then I want to hear that it's true. And I want to know how. I want you to prove that it's true under certain conditions. These are foundational moves. Precision means I need more detail in what in your answer, let's say, or I don't have enough information really to understand this. I need more detail. That's what we're doing here. I'm giving you more detail on a substantive conception of critical thinking. Relevance is another very important, essential intellectual standard that is violated routinely in human life. How many times have you been in a meeting in which an hour later, after beginning, very little had been accomplished? I've been an administrator at a college before for many years, and so I know how this works. And so when we understand the importance of relevance in thinking, then we can make certain very foundational moves like this. Let's see. We have this question on the floor, and now someone else is adding this question. Now, this second question seems significant, but I'm wondering how it's relevant to our first question. Or are we going to set aside the first question and deal with the second question because we see it as more significant? One material point here is we want to distinguish between or pull apart the issues that we're dealing with. And we can do this easily when we ask the question, how is that relevant? In my classes, when I ask a question to my students, they raise their hand, they want the answer. I hear the answer, I don't see the relevance. Very interesting response, but I'm not seeing the relevance. Can you help me see the relevance? So they help me see the relevance. Or they say, oh, you're right, I didn't really see that. And I say, oh, good, you didn't see it. That's okay. You now see that it's not relevant. That's the most important thing, that you're understanding the importance of relevance in thinking, and so that when you're in a real conversation in real life and somebody makes a move, you can say, wait a minute, how's that relevant? So this is what we're looking for, the pay dirt. We're looking for a better way of living through our instruction, through educating the mind. So as you see, I can go through the other standards, which I'm not going to do at the moment. I want you to understand them, again, as essential intellectual standards that we should be adhering to every day in human life, whether implicitly or explicitly, and that they come from a much larger set of intellectual standards, perhaps hundreds or even thousands or even more intellectual standards that exist in natural languages and that can be found in good dictionaries. So we need intellectual standards. We need to be able to take our thinking apart, looking at the elements of reasoning, purpose, question, information. Again, so we have the elements and we have the standards, but we also need this piece if we are going to foster genuine critical thinking in human societies, because genuine human thinking entails fair-minded critical thinking. I want to spend a little bit of time on this piece. It is the third primary piece or conceptual set in our approach to critical thinking. And again, when you see these intellectual traits or virtues, I would like for you to understand this diagram as illuminating a few or some of the essential intellectual traits or virtues in the liberally educated mind. So that these come from a larger set of intellectual virtues, but they give us a good beginning place with students. And we won't be able to really get much further with students because we'll spend years focusing on these and we'll still have greater depth of understanding to go to understand them. So in other words, understanding critical thinking, developing as a critical thinker entails a truly lifelong approach, because these virtues cannot be easily developed. They are It is possible for humans to develop these. In other words, we have the capacity to develop these, but we don't develop these naturally. In other words, we can't depend on the mind to develop these naturally. In fact, we can expect the opposite. So let me unpack this a bit. Our argument here is that we can't afford simply to foster skills and abilities in human minds, critical thinking skills and abilities, because when we do that, what we inadvertently foster is what my colleague Richard Paul many years ago termed weak sense critical thinking. Weak sense critical thinking is to be distinguished from strong sense critical thinking, and there's a way in which the distinction is simple, and it means this. Weak sense critical thinkers are focused on using critical thinking to get what they want, to advance their interests without respect to the rights and needs of others. It's important to hear that last piece. Strong sense critical thinkers, on the other hand, are also pursuing their rights and needs and desires, but while taking into account the needs and desires of relevant others. And so what we see right now in teaching and learning is that we are already inadvertently fostering weak sense critical thinking because we are not, in many cases, accurately representing what critical thinking entails. So we're teaching the ability separate from the traits. So here's an ability, for instance, the ability to gather relevant information. We'll see these sorts of moves being made in standards across the world, across the country, certainly. To gather relevant information is a critical thinking ability. But I can gather relevant information if I'm thinking in a weak sense or an unethical way. I can gather relevant information and systematically distort that information or ignore other relevant information. This is done every day ad nauseum by human beings living on the planet. And so what we want to understand is that when we teach for these abilities without the virtues, then we're actually creating more of a problem in terms of human greed and human power and human problems than when we, as it were, don't teach for critical thinking at all. And so what we must do, in our view, is to place these virtues at the center of a substantive conception so that students are learning to distinguish between what they know and what they don't know. For instance, now I'm focusing on intellectual humility. Distinguishing between what you know and what you don't know is a very important critical thinking virtue. When I am modeling the kind of thinking I'm looking for in student thinking, then I'm going to make moves like this, intellectual moves. I'll say, let's see, I'm not sure exactly what the answer is. My best thinking right now is this. However, there's a lot of information I don't have right now. So you help me. Or here's another move. Yesterday, I made this argument in class. I was very sure of myself yesterday. And you may recall that there was quite a lot of emotion behind what I said yesterday. But upon reflection, I realized that I had not thought of certain parts of the problem, or I was not considering certain viewpoints. And now I'm admitting to you, my students, that there was a problem in my thinking. And I want us to applaud that moment where we can say, this is where I was wrong. And that as a community, well, let me just say, as a community, we want to encourage this, a community of teachers, community of faculty, and a community of human beings. We want to honor when people are willing to tell us when they're wrong. The opposite of this is intellectual arrogance, and this we carry around with us through daily life. Think of all of the times when you have said, no, I don't think that's true, when you were later proven wrong. Think of the person that you know that's considered a brick wall because nothing that you say affects them. They don't hear it. They can't hear it because they're so sure that they're correct. These are real problems in teaching and learning. This is an extra. This is part of the heart and soul of teaching and learning. Humans are highly compartmentalized as thinkers. In other words, we're often intellectual hypocrites because we fail to see that what we are doing in one domain of our life, thinking and living in, let's say, a highly ethical way, is very different from the way we're living over here. It may be a highly unethical way. So the person who's abusive at the office may be very kind and caring and loving at home, or the other way around. So how do we explain these blatant inconsistencies in human thought, these contradictions? Each of us has to ask ourselves that question. So let me stop and give you a minute to process these virtues. Now, I've only unpacked a couple of them, but my question to you is this. To what extent are you fostering these virtues in your department or at your institution right now? To what extent are you fostering these in your work with students? And you can just focus on the two that I've mentioned, or any of these that you might read and think, well, this might be what it means, and so this is how I connect with it. So for just about 1.5 minutes, process and write down your thoughts if you can. Now I want to connect the points I was making about traits of mind to this next point. We might cap this introduction by saying that the only way to learn a subject is to construct the ideas in the subject, in one's thinking, using one's thinking. But if we're going to do this, then we must be aware of the traits of mind, and we must be using these, or let's say we must be fostering these traits in our own thinking, because if we're not doing so, then we're not seeing what we don't understand within the discipline. We won't understand the information we still need to gather within the discipline. And we won't be able to think autonomously in the discipline using our own thinking. So in other words, if we're going to learn a subject, and we will need to construct the ideas of that subject in our thinking, we will need these virtues to do it. So for instance, let's take confidence in reason, which I haven't mentioned yet. Confidence in reason means that I, the thinker, when I am embodying confidence and reason, I want to be moved by arguments, by argumentation in the high sense that is better than my thinking. I want to enter the evidence in good faith, and I want to change my thinking if your thinking is better than mine. I'm disconnected to, I disconnect the thinking from the person who is articulating the thinking, and I'm disconnecting my identity from my own thinking, and I'm saying, well, here are my ideas, and you're saying, well, here are my ideas, and I'm saying, well, your ideas sound better, so let's go with those. Rather than, no, I think we'll go with my ideas, even though, yeah, yours might be okay, but yeah, no, I think we'll go with this. Those are the kinds of moves that people make. They're not hearing the argument. So when we have confidence and reason, we're open to hearing the information that we don't want to hear, that we may not have heard before, and we're moved by the arguments themselves rather than the people making the arguments. So this is essential. This embodying this and all the intellectual virtues are essential to cultivating the mind and developing as a thinker, and therefore to thinking within a field or discipline. Take intellectual perseverance. How often do our students fail at the level of perseverance? I would argue that most students don't have a conception. They don't really know what it means to suffer through that unpleasant process which is involved in learning deep ideas of any kind. To many of our students, intellectual perseverance means you finish the paper when it was due the next morning for class. But and therefore I got it done. I persevered through it. God, it was really tough. It was really hard, but I got it done. But you got it done late. And so you got it, you did it poorly probably because you didn't give yourself enough time and you didn't understand the process. You don't understand what it means to discipline the mind if that's how you are behaving routinely in terms of your own learning. But we can't blame our students because they don't have the concept of intellectual perseverance. They don't have the concept of confidence and reason. They don't have the concept of intellectual empathy. They don't know how to enter an argument that they disagree with and articulate it in good faith and accurately. These are our responsibilities to teach our students these ideas. Again, there are many ways to think about the relationship between thinking and content and to set the stage for the importance of a substantive conception of critical thinking in teaching and learning. Whatever else is true, content, the product of reasoning or content, must be understood by thinking. It is constructed by thinking. It can only be modified by thinking, applied, questioned by thinking, assessed by thinking. Over and over again, we come back to our thinking. So let us now move to some essential ingredients of a professional development program. And the first one I've already elaborated quite, or to some degree, and that is choose a substantive conception. Now, I've been talking about a substantive conception, a deep conception. We can say, what is such a conception? How would you articulate it? Well, first of all, it must, in my view, address what really happens every day in human thinking, in human reasoning. Here is one way to think of our lives diagrammatically. We're going through life and we've got objects, things that we have to figure out. To figure these things out constantly. Get up in the morning. Am I going to stop by the store on the way to work? What problems am I going to have to deal with? You're in the class. You're dealing with these problems. As an administrator, you're dealing with multiple problems and issues throughout your day. This is what it means to be a human. There is a logic to this which we can unpack by focusing on the elements of reasoning. And there are standards that we can use to assess these elements. So what I'm saying is that when you're choosing your conception of critical thinking for your program, I would argue that you must ensure that you are focused on a conception that entails understanding of the elements of our reasoning and that argues for the importance of universal intellectual standards that have been used again by educated persons throughout recorded history and beyond. This substantive conception that we are seeking must also entail not only the elements and the standards, but as I've already said, it must entail the intellectual traits. And I can spend more time on this, but we're not going to have that time right now. And this substantive conception, this brings all of these three conceptual sets together. But this substantive conception must also take into account that the human mind is, let's say, it causes problems for us naturally. I've focused on the analysis of thinking, the assessment of thinking, elements, standards, and traits. But we also have another problem that we need or a set of concepts that I believe are essential to a substantive conception of critical thinking, and that is some understanding of the tendencies, natural, automatic, intrinsic, native tendencies of the human mind that we could loosely term egocentricity and sociocentricity. And I'm just going to briefly mention that when we say egocentric thinking, we mean something very basic. My way is the best way. I am the center of the universe. My needs trump everyone else's needs and desires, or my needs and desires trump everyone else's. We see this kind of behavior very easily in young children, but what we don't understand is that we as adults are also engaging routinely in these same sorts of selfish and narrow-minded behaviors, but we're doing it much more in a much more sophisticated way so that we can hide these moves from ourselves and from others. Sociocentric thinking in shortcut form means groupthink, or when we are thinking within our group, and a group can be two or more people, made up of two or more people, but within this logic, when we're thinking sociocentrically, we believe our way is the best way. And we judge all other groups according to our group standards. And so our school is the best, our institution is the best, our country is the best, our team is the best, we're going to win. When we're thinking within this logic, we don't see the problems in our thinking as a group. We're not looking for the problems in our thinking. And we can be very dangerous. And we're seeing the real dangers implicit in sociocentric thinking being played out in the world stage right now in a way that is truly horrifying. So we are egocentric persons first. We're asking in the privacy of our own minds, unconsciously or subconsciously, how can you, the world, serve me? And when you, the world, are not serving me, then I'm not okay, I'm not happy, and this is happening naturally in my mind. So these are forces within us that come through defense mechanisms, stereotyping, projection, denial, delusions of grandeur, all of these defense mechanisms and pathological ways of thinking that have been illuminated by theoreticians for at least the last 100 years, beginning with Freud and Anna Freud. So these concepts have been developed, and they're very important for us to understand if we are going to foster critical thinking across the curriculum, because our students are bringing their egocentricity and their sociocentricity into the classroom when they walk in the door, and we are doing the same. So obviously we are opening up a number of concepts that we cannot pursue more deeply at this moment, but we have a beginning place for thinking about a substantive conception. So when you are looking for a conception, choose a conception that really fits reality. And to me, reality entails understanding that I'm reasoning, that I need to be reasoning at the highest level, adhering to intellectual standards, that I need to be trying to develop within myself intellectual virtues, and I must be aware of these egocentric and sociocentric tendencies within me that would keep me from reaching my potential. A second key ingredient, and these are related, or interrelated, is choose a conception that is systematic, integrated, one that we can use across disciplines and subjects, and again, that is based in technical, it's based in non-technical, rather than technical language. I don't have much time to elaborate this diagram, but I want to point out a few pieces of concepts here. When you are assessing frameworks, consider these polarities. Is this idea, is this framework, are the ideas implicit in it? Are they implicit or are they explicit? In other words, do we have actual words that we can use like clarity, accuracy, relevance, or is it something that's sort of hidden and I don't really know how to grasp it? So that often we'll hear faculty say things like, well, I don't really know exactly what critical thinking looks like, but I know when I see it. I don't see how students can do much with that. So with the tools that have been developed in our framework, largely by Dr. Richard Paul starting more than 35 years ago and by other Paulian scholars throughout the last 20 years and more, we have been elaborating these concepts, but we're looking for the explicit ideas that we can actually use and discuss and gain leverage from. Is this a specialized approach that you're using so that it's only going to be useful in one discipline, or are we seeing within this framework a global generalizations that we can use? Is it systematic? Is this framework going to offer a systematic and integrated approach, or is it going to be episodic? This is a very serious problem in teaching and learning, because often very good teachers will be episodically fostering critical thinking. For instance, they may be teaching the importance of looking at point of view in thinking. And so they'll focus on point of view, but they don't have the other elements, so it's episodic. Or they'll say, okay, I had this very good assignment. I'll do this very good assignment. And it is, objectively, very good critical thinking assignment, but they only do it once or twice. It's like teaching basketball by having the players doing layups and free throws once or twice. We learn critical thinking when we are applying these ideas routinely and systematically again and again through daily life. I've already focused on the distinction between weak and strong sense critical thinking. Another way of saying this is to say that we can ask the question, is this framework that you're looking for focusing on a sophistic approach or a weak sense approach or skills only approach, or is it focusing on a Socratic or fair-minded approach? And then again, we can further elaborate this, but let me stop there. And so what I'd like you to do is ask yourself this question: to what extent are you fostering a conception which is explicit and global and systematic and Socratic in orientation, or to what extent are you focusing in an implicit way, in an episodic way, and so forth? Think about that for just a minute and process what I've been saying, and you can send any questions in that you'd like right now as well, just for 1.5 minutes. Let's move forward. I've already talked about the importance of choosing a conception that fosters traits of mind as well as intellectual abilities. And I've, again, briefly elaborated these ideas. And just to to elaborate them a little more, note that we need to have a conception of critical thinking that entails understanding of what exists in human reasoning, that is these parts are present. And then we need to use these parts with sensitivity to these standards. So just to bring them together for you very quickly, in other words, for example, if we're focusing on purpose, we want to be clear about our purpose. We want to make sure that we're dealing with significant purposes where relevant. When we are articulating the question or the questions at issue, we want to make sure that, again, we're clear, that we bring enough precision to the process to unpack the question, that the question is relevant to the purpose, and that these two are directly relevant. As we gather information, we need to make sure that that information is accurate and relevant to the question at issue. And a standard that's not listed here, but one that's very important, is we need to make sure that the information that we're using is sufficient to answer the question. That's a standard that my colleague, Dr. Gerald Nosich, has brought into his work, and that is also very important in human thinking. So I'm just wanting to here show you some of the connections between the elements and the standards. We've already talked a little bit about the intellectual standards, and again, we could further elaborate those. And when we work with faculty, we spend much time helping them contextualize these ideas in their own disciplines. So we've talked about a substantive conception a little bit. Let's move to some other key ingredients of a professional development program in critical thinking. Commit to the very long run. Notice it doesn't just say long run. In 35 years, we've worked with many institutions to help them bring critical thinking into the fabric of teaching and learning at the institution or in the department. Often the pattern that we see is enthusiasm, a good beginning, an orientation that's focused on reaccreditation or accreditation of some sort. There is some funding set aside, and we get something like a 3-year maybe run with that organization, and then new administration comes into the process, and we no longer need accreditation, and so forth and so on. If you want to be highly skilled at tennis, then you must commit to the very long run in terms of practicing as a tennis player. If you want to be very good as a musician, you must commit to the very long run. If you want to be good as a thinker within any field or discipline, you must commit to the very long run. And if we are going to bring these ideas across the institution or department, we have to understand that it takes a first year or two to understand what we're even doing here, to have a sense of what the actual process will entail. And so we need a beginning place. We have to understand this professional development process as highly organic, meaning that it's going to change. It has to be dynamic. And we have to understand that it's going to take a long time and committed effort. I'm very pleased to have so many administrators here for this reason, because if we don't have deep administrative commitment, this won't work. And what is ideal is to have at least one or more top level administrators who not only are supporting critical thinking at the institution, in the department, but who believe in the ideas. Because when we believe in the ideas, then we live in a very different way, and we try to advance the ideas where we can. But if we aren't learning the ideas, then we're basically saying the ideas are good for someone else, not really for me. And we need time with administrators. We need time with students to help them understand how to reach for this commitment. Every professional development process needs a leadership team that will guide the process. That leadership team may and will likely change over time. We should be open to bringing new people in, as other people maybe aren't as committed as we would hope them to be, or don't have the time, hope that they would be, or perhaps they don't have the time. But we must have a leadership team that understands the process to be complex, and where we can lay down some processes, such as regular meetings, readings where we discuss meetings, things like that. But we've got to have the team to regularly meet and, again, guide the process forward. If we want to bring critical thinking into the community, the instructional community, then they will need some education in what critical thinking entails. And I will be talking in a few minutes about some of the opportunities that we offer in our community. There is not one perfect way to do this, but what we have found in our work is that faculty need hands-on training with a presenter who's working with a substantive conception of critical thinking, and they need multiple workshops over time. It's difficult to ever get the time that we need with faculty and staff to advance critical thinking at the level that we really want in our communities, in our instructional communities. Funding is an issue, and now is a good time for people to be seeking grant funding in whatever ways that they can. It's unfortunate that we are able to, in this country, fund other programs at a much higher level than we seem to be willing to fund critical thinking. If we look at the level of funding, let's say for athletics, versus the level of funding for intellectual development of the mind, it's disconcerting. I'm an athlete. I enjoy athletics. I think we should have athletics in human life. But we also must have the advancement of human societies, and that, in my view, is more important. And we've got to figure out every way that we can to fund the program, but we can't expect that there will be no funding. And so we want to figure out how we're going to fund it. We want to figure out how many days of workshops our faculty can reasonably come to workshops for. We need to figure out how to bring the leadership team into this process. And we need to be inclusive. We want everybody in the community involved in bringing critical thinking to teaching and learning and to our students. And we're not going to get everyone. That's by implication. But if we're going to foster the societies that we're capable of fostering in this world, then we've got to be inclusive. Everyone's thinking matters. And so we want our students to hear that message, and we want faculty to hear that message. We want staff to hear that message. We want everyone to participate in the cultivation of their own minds, because when they do, all of us benefit from that reality. Many of you are already doing this, tying critical thinking to assessment, accreditation, and the institution's mission. This is helping advance critical thinking. But as you know, we have still many problems because though we may be moving towards critical thinking in the accreditation process, the real question is what happens at the other side of this. Are we continuing the language? Are students coming out with the lingua franca of critical thinking? Are they internalizing these ideas so that they're going out into their lives and into their classes and they're saying, wait a minute, what's the purpose here? What's the key question at issue? What am I assuming right now? What are you assuming right now? These are moves that educated persons make and that we want our students to be able to make as well. When we teach for critical thinking, using a robust conception, we help students, among other things, come to understand that every subject and discipline is a domain of thought. And here are some examples. So when I'm teaching my students, I want to ask myself, if I'm teaching astronomy, am I teaching my students to think within the field of astronomy or astronomical thinking, artistic thinking, technological thinking? Notice the emphasis on thinking. What does it look like to think like a poet? If I'm teaching poetry, that's what I need to help my students understand. What does it mean to think like a good educator, a good administrator? What about a librarian? What kinds of good, let's say, intellectual moves are librarians making right now in human societies to protect the ideas that we're losing through the loss of print media? These are big questions, and there are many others. When we are fostering critical thinking, we understand the logic of our content, the logic of critical thinking, and we understand that we must connect with the logic of student thinking. Students do not come to us as bumps on a log. They come to us with their bad habits of thinking that we as teachers have often fostered. They're wondering, when do I get out of here? Why do I have to learn this? Why am I having to cram more of these things into my head? They wonder why we're bothering in the privacy of their own mind, because they're not going to be connecting to the thinking unless we can get into the logic of their thinking. And part of the logic of their thinking we focus on here, intellectual perseverance, they lack, for instance. Part of the logic of their thinking is that they want things to be easy and quick and lacking in any sort of pain. Why? Not because they're students, but because they're humans. We're all like this. So what is the student bringing in the terms of his logic when he walks in the door? We need to know this. How can I connect to the logic of student thinking? That's one of my questions. I need critical thinking to do this. Just for a minute and a half or so, look at this diagram and process this a bit. To what extent do you believe that at your institution or in your department that you're taking into account the logic of the content, the logic of student thinking, and the logic of critical thinking? How do you see the interrelationship, and how can you better foster it in your teaching or with your faculty? Just for a couple of minutes, think about this, in these interconnections. we are going to be running out of time in a few minutes, so let me wrap this up with a few further thoughts. We're looking at the website of the Foundation for Critical Thinking, and I would like to invite you to attend and to send faculty to our 35th International Conference on Critical Thinking. We hope that you will join us. Every conference is unique. Every conference is a moment in time not to be missed. We'll have a number of sessions that will be interesting and important for your faculty to consider attending. We'll also offer some of our sessions online. Bringing critical thinking into the heart of teaching and learning. Here are just some of the sessions. Teaching students how to write a paper using the principles of critical thinking, incorporating critical thinking assessment into the fabric of teaching and learning every day, and so forth. I hope that you'll join us and send a team of faculty to that event, which we plan and hold for you, our community, every year. It's exciting to be entering our 35th, or to be offering a 35th International Conference, and there'll be people there from institutions across the world sharing their struggles with this process, and many of them will be doing concurrent sessions that you'll want to attend. We are going to be offering our academic webinars once a month from this point forward. Again, we'll be sending a letter to you from me. I'll send you a letter explaining what we're offering, what the title will be. Hopefully you will continue to join us and invite others. If you would like to talk with me about professional development and critical thinking, or one of our fellows, please email and let us know. We're here for you to help support your program. We're offering now our Thinker's Guides through electronic licensing, so you may be interested in that for your students. And finally, we have an upcoming International Fellows Academy where we will be working in an intimate capacity with those who would like to join us after the conference and to continue our learning and deepening our understanding of critical thinking. As we close, I want to talk just briefly about the online platform that we've been using and that I see as a possibility for us in terms of a learning and teaching tool. I want to quote just briefly from a white paper that's been written by the president of Ubiquity University, in which he says that projections indicate that upwards of 40% of the brick and mortar schools will no longer exist by 2020. That's only 5 years from now. And even if his projections are off ever so slightly, what we know is that the online learning platforms are where the future of learning will be held, so to speak. These are our halls of academia. And we need to collectively learn how to use these platforms to bring students into deep thinking. And we know that we're facing great challenges with these platforms, but we also now are realizing great opportunities because we can connect with people, faculty, administrators, students from across the world who want to learn deep ideas. In this session, we are doing, as it were, a webcast. You're not able to talk with me, and I can't see you on my screen, but in our online programs, our customized programs, we are trying to replicate the brick and mortar classroom as much as possible so that you will be joining us, or your faculty will join us in groups, and we'll be able to work together in groups, and we'll be able to see one another on our screens. This is part of the future that is available to us, and there are people across the globe, including us, trying to bring best practices and create best practices in online learning. So we want to take the lead in this. We want to talk to you through these conversations about the ideas that you are interested in. So let us know what those ideas are. Communicate with us. Let us know your questions. Let us know your concerns, and help us support your program in any way that we can. again, our focus is on bringing critical thinking to teaching and learning, because we understand that students must learn to think within the disciplines, within the fields of study, in order to reason through the complex problems that they face when they leave our high schools, colleges, and universities. There is a set of skills and abilities and traits that is now required of them to survive and to advance human societies. This is not, as I see it, a choice. Rather, this is an imperative. We at the Foundation for Critical Thinking are very concerned to continue developing a substantive conception of critical thinking, and we invite all ideas that are substantive to this conception, any idea that helps us live better, live at a higher level, to reach self-fulfillment and self-actualization, and to have the kinds of intimate relationships, marriages that we can have, to think within the field of medicine at the level that we're capable of thinking, so that we're honoring the human who's in the medical system and so forth. And I could give many examples and go on. But the point is that we must begin to embrace these tools, and I applaud the work that you are doing in advancing these ideas, and again invite you to let us know how we can help you. With that, I'm going to close and thank you for joining us. I'm Linda Elder, and I'm the president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking.